Mark, it's awesome to see you. I was fortunate enough to see you at the Chicago e-learning and technology showcase, and you had the keynote, and you had a really good keynote. You got a lot of people engaged. I love the live polling. After that conference or going through the live polling, were there any surprises in the data that came out of that, or the conversations that came out of the
Yeah,
discussion?
let me give your audience a little context around that polling piece. So what I had done, as you recall, is I presented the ideal description of an organizational design element. And that's a big word, right? So what I'm talking about is every organization has knowledge management. If you formalize it or don't, information is moving. You've got recognition and rewards. Even if it's not formalized, you're patting people on the back, in your small organizations. So what I did is I crafted really tight descriptions about if your organization's design elements, those two, for example, were designed in a way that enhanced social activity, connection, collaboration, sharing. And I asked people in the room, is this you? Is this your organization? Does your knowledge management look like this? Does your recognition awards, does your management philosophy, your business processes? And what I thought was interesting was, if you remember how it's scatter plotted all over the place, where
Yep.
people really agreed with it or they really disagreed but the surprising thing was there was consistently some of the organizations were like, yeah, that's us. But it was much smaller, than on the scale I'd love to see, where organizations are really thinking about their people being connected and collaborating. But there's still the pleasant surprise was, there was people who were saying, yeah, I highly agree with that. That's who we are. I would say that percentage was probably somewhere in the range of like 12 to 15%, and everything else shifted kind of like, no, we're not there. So that to me was a good sign. And, I love presenting because the conversations that follow are always me hunting down that one person who said, that's us. I'm like, oh, good. I want to talk to you. I want to see what you guys are doing to make that happen and make it consistent. But I think also the message around that is, if you're not doing it, that's a problem. How do we get there? How do we move forward, to make those changes in your organization? But if you are doing it, are you conscious of it? So that when things change in the business, are you going to be able to maintain that connection and collaboration and that system that you have, that organizational piece that you have?
I like I don't know if this is an analogy or a metaphor, but the example of the freeway system that you use
Oh, yeah.
as a way to kind of pull this flow of information, flow of people, flow of things that happen inside that organization ecosystem. And as a city continues to build out, you
Right.
have to modify the connection points and
Yep.
realize that where some of the choke points are, where some of the disconnection is, and how that ultimately impacts the system that
Well, yeah.
is growing inside your business. Fair?
Right.
What so when you think about things like friction, and you talked about friction inside your book, Social by Design.
Yeah.
What are some friction points that get created inside organizations that typically stifle communication, collaboration, growth, problem solving,
Yeah.
culture? What are some of the friction points that tend to get created
I mean, it's a
inside
hard one,
business?
I think, for people to really, especially leadership, to put their heads around, because at the end of the day, a business is design has a purpose, and a lot of times that purpose is obviously to make money, right? And so we obviously try to maximize our talent and our time to production. Either it's an output of a service or a product. And I think one of the greatest pieces of friction in an organization that separates people is our focus on that time on task, how we define what time on task means in an organization. That we're not really creating the space in our organization for people to take a breath, to reflect on how they're learning in the work that they're doing, and then just being able to share and create the systems and processes, and obviously adopt the tools in the right way to help people share that information openly in the organization. So that's a general look at the problem I think we have in organizations. Is there's such a drive to push and create more, and rightfully so. It's grow or die for most organizations that I've been a part of or see. And yet at the same time, it's like, if you don't create that space, you're risking the lack of the innovation, the creativity, and getting those people around the really sticky problems in your organization that continually come up over and over again. And you're waiting for some miracle to happen to solve it, when they're all really there, and maybe they're in cube number 354, but they don't have the time. So time is a friction. It's an element of friction in an organization. It's a big one for sure. But I think other things I talk about, as you know, from the keynote and the book, is there's these elements to how we design our organizations, and it's like I look at about 8, 9 different things. And some of those things, like I mentioned early on, are like recognition and rewards. How do we reward people in the organization? Most organizations recognize and reward individual contribution. We pat somebody on the back, we elevate them in the hierarchy, we move them forward. But we do know, and everybody knows it, but doesn't want to admit it, is that person who's really doing very well in the organization has been influenced by others in the organization. They've gotten other ideas. They've had the conversations. And those things are underground, right? We don't see them. We need to elevate them. We need to come up with better ways in our organization to recognize teamwork, to reward the efforts of everybody involved in that project or that process that made a difference in the organization.
How can we do that?
Well, I mean, frankly, it starts going back to what I said, is like, look carefully. I would say the first thing is mapping what you have. Who are you? From an instructional design standpoint, Mike, it's like, what's our current state? What's our desired state? But I asked the question in the keynote, you might remember, is how many people in here have articulated these things? How many of you have articulated what you do about knowledge management? How have you articulated your business processes and what they look like? In general, very few hands went up. They haven't really documented it. To me, that's the first step. You can't fix something until you define it. So the first step in the process is, who are we now? How do we do things now? And then looking at that and saying, how is that holding us back from connecting people in our organization to making those knowledge transfers and those really rich conversations from happening? That's the first step. I mean, it's something you can't necessarily survey your people alone in that. You really need to observe the work and how the work is done, to do that. So it doesn't have to be lengthy. It just has to be honest, with your employees, and get that feedback and then input.
Why do we struggle with the honesty when it comes to that? The honesty from an observation standpoint, or the honesty relative to the data, and not trying to make the data tell a story that we want it to tell, but actually tell the story that exists. Why do we struggle with this?
Yeah, I think we live in highly competitive environments. At the end of the day, as much as an organization strives for bringing their people together and having a level playing field, that's not really the game for a lot of people. They know that in a lot of ways, what I know, if I give it freely to you, it could be zero sum. And I feel like I'm going to lose, you're going to win. This isn't good. I mean, we give an example of that in the book, which was one of the first things I started with a keynote. And it's one of the trigger moments for that really shifted my thinking around connection and collaboration. So in my history, Mike, you might know, my career started in education, and I moved into instructional design, and you and I were at SmartForce together many, many moons ago, in different departments, as people might be, not know. And designing simulations is where I was. So I was very much into e-learning forever and instructional design. And when social media emerged, I started to look at the capabilities, how we use tools like that inside the company. And then I started realizing people weren't using them inside the company in the ways we wanted them to use them inside the company. They were great at sharing pictures of their cats or vacations and all that kind of stuff. And that's good. It's heartwarming. It's engaging. We get that. But really what companies want is, I want your opinions on how do we do X better, right? Or I want to know, like, what do we do in these various situations, and what are some of your hacks and things. And what happened was, there was a study that was done, just to share it with your audience, that showed, that even with a hint of a recession, you're going to see people stop sharing knowledge, even just a whisper of a downturn. And so that moment was like, oh, like, everybody nods when I bring that up. Like, yeah, I get that. Everybody thinks that way, but that's because our organizations have been designed to be, in a way, to be competitive. And we create this environment, which is, if I give to you, I'm lesser than, I'll lose my job, right? I'm not going to advance. And that's the problem. The problem is we accept that as a reality, versus what can we change in our organizations to create an environment which is much more connected and less likely to be competitive.
And then you get into some of the stuff that you talked about a little bit earlier on in many cases, the answer is more, or at least we think that's more. It's more work. It's more people. It's more. And I think I think we're losing the fact that actually less is more, and we
Yeah.
can accomplish so much more when we simplify and we reduce and we stay focused and own that identity rather than get into the situation of saying, especially in a competitive environment, of I'm just going to keep doing more and pile on, and I'm going to take credit, and I'm going to do all of these things. It's interesting to hear you bring up the point around the recession. How are you seeing things shift in the market today, given the economic climate? And we're recording this in October of 2023. The economic climate that we've been going through over the course of the last, let's go back as far as 12, 18, 36 months and get into that pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and now financial challenges that we're running into in the market. Are you seeing a lot of the stuff that you wrote about back in 2021 could get reinforced even further and go deeper and deeper into organizations, and this stuff repeating itself, or have we changed a little bit?
It's funny. I mean, the concepts in the book and the ideas in the book are meant to be timeless.
Sure. Yeah.
Not something that you look back and go, oh, that's all about technology, and that technology has changed, because it's not. It's not about that. But I think I guess what was enlightening was during the pandemic, there's like these light bulbs went off for a lot of companies as they had this, diaspora of employees, all, distributed work, and nobody was coming to the offices and stuff. And all of a sudden it became like, oh God, the water cooler is really important. Like, like that, those conversations are critical, and we're not having them anymore. So then a lot of distributed work is still happening now, remote work, however you want to call it. And yet I think a lot of business went back to status quo. Like, we had this moment of like, oh yeah, this is really critical to keep our people together. We need to put emphasis, and then people's roles shifted to like community management in organizations and using social technologies and da. And then once everything was back to the office, or even just back to normal, that died down again. We lost that edge. And it's like, it reminds me of how much people like to talk about the importance of employee engagement and the importance of people being together, but then they don't really live it. It's back to what it was. And I think, honestly, is this is a horrible thing to say, and I know it from a point of view of how many people died during the pandemic, but if the pandemic had lasted longer, right, and kept people separated, we might have seen better longer-term infrastructure change in how organizations are designed around their people versus their process. Arguable, I know. It's arguable.
It's an interesting perspective to take. The thing that world according to me kind of thing. So opinion and one perspective, but it seems like the people who are talking about going back into the workplace, going back into the office, drawing people back in, are doing it more from the line of sight management perspective than the general organization health, behavior, productivity, community collaboration perspective. Is that just my bias jumping out at it, or is that, or do you kind of get that sense as well?
Yeah, I get that sense. I mean, I think you got to remember that the ideas of hierarchical management structures are well ingrained. Yeah. And I don't blame managers. I think I see a lot. I posted about this too. I get mad because I'm like, stop blaming managers. They're being asked to fit into a system. This is how we do it. And it's like, if I'm going to stay here at this job, I have to do it this way. So it's not really them. It's not the individual, the human being, because they get blasted. And it's like everybody piles and gloms on to manager change. We gotta change middle managers, and they need to do better. And I think higher up the hierarchy, the executives, the C-suite are just kind of chuckling because they're not getting the blame, right? So it's not really about the system and the processes and the protocols around management that are getting criticized. It's the human being. And that's not fair. But I think that change is just so, I mean, that system is just so well entrenched through the industrial era that this is what management looks like and needs to be like. That, yeah, you're right. They're used to like the managing by sight, right? I can walk around, I see people working, I feel better about it, versus managing by deliverable and deadline and all those things that we can easily do now with technology. It's still well entrenched, unfortunately. But I think the more progressive organizations, if their stories emerge, it starts to spread a little bit. The only problem with those type of stories and the systems that some of these places, like the Googles get a lot of attention, the Amazons get a lot of attention for some of the different ways they go about things. But the problem is a lot of times organizations will say, oh, we're going to do that. We're going to bring that to our company, the way they do it. And they try to just bolt it on, but they're not designed that way. So it fails. It fails miserably because they didn't modify it to their culture, what they have in place. So, it's a long answer to say, yeah, I agree with you 100%. It still is what it is.
Well, and the example, like you bring up Google. So, a lot of times, whether it's Google or Intel, people will think of Doer and they'll think of OKRs. And you go through all of these organizations who implement OKRs. And anecdotally, I believe that 95% of the organizations that implement OKRs have not read Doer's book. They go through the process of implementing OKRs and rolling these out across the organization and forget that Doer recommends that you do this inside your organization at a leadership level for a 6-month period so that you can understand how the process and how the systems work and then determine next steps relative to rolling out throughout the organization. But no, let's go ahead and read a book and roll it out because it worked for Google. And
then also, like what you just said, is a perfect example of executives who buy into this, and then they're like, well, that's not for us. That's for them.
We don't need that. We're already past that. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that you had highlighted in the book that I thought was pretty powerful is the idea of moving from policies to guidelines. Why are guidelines important to you?
Well, in the context of the book, guidelines, that we speak about it, James, my co-author, James Tyre, we speak about it in the sense that, a lot of times in organizations, how they use social media internally. So I'm talking about tools like what's now known as Viva Engage, which was Yammer, Microsoft Teams, and Slack, and goes on and on. They create a lot of times policy around those tools' use are very, I guess, prohibitive, right? They start from a point of like, don't. And it's just, it's human nature of like that creates a connotation in their minds of like, oh shoot, this place is dangerous. I don't want to engage in here because it's going to, again, go back to affect my livelihood. It reminds me of the stories I remember when I was a younger parent, and my kids were little. You would tell your kid all the time when they grab a glass, of milk or something like that, don't spill that milk. You'd yell. Well, that's teaching them nothing. What we teach them is like, this is how you hold it. Yeah. And that's a perfect example of guidelines versus a policy. Policies tend to be pejorative and they limit the thinking. But what we talk about is, and I did this with work at Systems Made Simple before I joined the Learning Guild. I was the head of L&D there, and we had I had built like what I guess I would term to be the first ever social centered corporate university. It was really designed with social technology and integrating a lot of things. But one of the things we established early on was the guidelines. Here's how to use these tools. Here's what to do. And what that did is reframe the thinking about, if I focus on doing these things, I'm invited in. It's positive in that way. But it's also like, hey, these are adults. Stop with the thinking about your employees as children and having to be pejorative. And I always think it's funny. We hire people and then we don't trust them. Like it's the first, why would you hire them in the first place if you're going to put down certain things that are just really about don't. Like, you didn't pick that up in the interview, like you're doing something wrong.
When you provide my view, when you provide guidelines or guiding principles or core values, whatever those things are, is kind of how we do what we do and ways that we make decisions. You create an opportunity where folks inside your organization can make decisions out in the field, and they don't have to keep coming back and asking for permission. And now they can be really creative. And you highlighted this in your keynote about communicating inside the organization. How do we go about solving problems? How do we think about solving problems? How do we go about making decisions? Do people know that throughout the organization? Are we getting closer, or are you starting to see a shift or a trend in the market where people are are helping people get better at problem solving and decision making? Or are we still stuck in this trap of, and I know we've talked a lot about it so far in this conversation, the more and more and more, or here's the policy, this is how you operate? Or are you seeing a shift in the market that leads you to be optimistic that we're taking maybe a principles-based approach or a tools-based approach to thinking about these challenges?
I think, in honesty, I've seen it more in my conversations with very small companies.
Okay, that's cool.
People who are 25, 50, maybe 100-person organization.
Yeah.
A lot of reasons why you find that openness, that transparency exists within the organization. It's not just proximity, that you have less people to interact. And it's not even always just the fact that it's natural in small organizations where everybody's kind of doing everything to get it done, right? So there's not this hierarchy, this pecking order that we see in larger organizations. It's honestly a less that they haven't really established a lot of policies and guidelines. Things that they come at from a point of view of like, we have so much at risk, we need to do it this way. And it kind of goes back to like what I said, even if you are big and you're seeing these barriers between people, it does come back to saying, have we ever really thought about can we articulate what we do here in this space, in the organizational design element? And then once we do, can we look at it carefully, objectively, and say, is the way we have it established keeping people apart? It's that simple. Is it keeping people away from each other? Is it preventing them psychologically, sociologically from wanting to engage with people? And how do we modify that? So if we're going to have a policy, it's more of a guideline, right? It's more of like, this is what we need this to look like. And then we create milestones to get there so that we know what right looks like. This is how we want things to be. So how do we start making those changes? Unfortunately, Mike, too much of our direction in organizations is put into the hands of our leadership. And the problem I find with leadership is at all levels. I don't care if you're C-suite or management. Leaders are fickle, right? The situation changes, they change. They get under pressure. You've heard the expression, shit rolls downhill, right? So it's like they change under the conditions. But if you create the healthiest of processes and protocols around your design, it's like the Constitution, right? For the organization, we will operate in this. We're not going to change this like the way we do things as we've documented it. So people have to work around that. But often we haven't articulated things. So it's just on a whim of a leader, of manager, how they're going to want and see things being done. And then if they have created a policy, it's usually to avoid and avert, risk in the organization. And that comes at a cost, a big cost in terms of connecting people and making them feel engaged and contributing to the purpose of the organization.
What are you optimistic about when it comes to?
I'm terribly pessimistic, don't I?
No, yeah, well, you do, and I know you've got to be an optimist to be a Syracuse fan. So, like, there's. So, what are you optimistic about relative to the things that you're seeing and hearing people talk about? And granted, talking and doing are two different things, but it starts with getting some of these thoughts out there. What are some of the things that you're optimistic about that you're hearing or seeing when you're out in the community, in the market, and you're out at events, whether events that you're putting on or events that you're participating in? What gives you reason to be optimistic?
I think it's a word you used before, and it's around simplicity and getting things more simple. I mean, we're constantly in organizations bombarded with new technology, new initiatives, new competitors, the list goes on and on. Yeah. And I think one of the things you're starting to see is these conversations that say, how do we get back to the core, values of who we are? How do we get back to the core processes that made us a strong business in the first place? So, and I'm talking about large businesses getting small again, so to speak. And that to me is optimistic, because I think ultimately it leads to, it leads back to people and the importance and the value that people bring that's not quantifiable sometimes, because you ultimately will get there at a point, when you start to get away from the complexity and treating people like cogs in a machine to get things done. So I'm optimistic because I keep hearing small, and I shared a story in the keynote too, the Barnes and Noble's turnaround. And, you had James Daunt, the CEO, come in and say, listen, we're a bookstore. We're going to be about books. We're going to make this space special. That's our purpose. We're not going to fight Amazon. And how we're going to do that is we're going to connect with the community better. And that changed management in terms of what their focus had to be. Their focus had to be, how do I engage, observe the community who comes into this bookstore to understand what their needs are? That's simple. And I think that's optimistic. And I'm a Syracuse fan, and it looks like a rough football year again.
I don't even want to talk about football with ASU right now.
But
however, so you had shared there's a 3-pronged strategy that he brought in when he came back, when he took over the helm at Barnes and Noble. And the beauty there is, if we know what the strategy is, then we can evaluate, is the work that we're doing align with that strategy. If it doesn't align with the strategy, then we should feel comfortable eliminating it. If it does, we should continue to move forward. And if we don't buy in to the strategy, we should exit. Like, those are all decisions that we can make as individuals, which is really powerful when there's that level of clarity.
Yeah. I think everything you just said is what's interesting about James Daunt's story, and I think it's lost in it because it's exciting, is it took desperation to get there. Like, we've been waiting, you know what I mean, to look around. Why are we waiting to see our market share tumble that far before we get to the point of saying, who are we? Who do we want to be? Have we gotten away from who we are? And what's the risk of doing that before the bottom falls out? And those are the conversations I'm optimistic that when you tell the stories of change and simplicity and getting back to core values and getting back to your people doing people things, right?
Yeah.
And then I think it opens up a world of possibilities. But it's staying, hearing that story when your company is successful, you might be apt to say, well, they were desperate, and that's not us. But there's lessons there, even if you're winning right now.
Yeah, and as a leader inside an organization, if you go and ask your people, the people who are part of your team, who are we as an organization? What do we do? Who do we serve? And the answers are all different.
Yeah.
You've got a challenge in front of you. And the cool thing about the challenge is now you've identified an opportunity to go in there and start addressing it. And maybe some things have changed, but when you ask those questions and you start to pull that out, then you can start to figure out how much alignment there is inside the organization across your people. And with that alignment, you can drive better integrity, which allows you to accomplish so much more. So that's the beauty of these simple questions that Mark has posed here as we're going through it. The other thing that's really cool about the conversation is, whether this happens inside organizations or happens to self, it seems like the same thing. Like, I can talk about wanting to get in better shape and working on my diet, but then when I go and get my blood work in and it looks like I've got high risk of something, now all of a sudden I get that catalyst or that spark to go out there and get those things done. The beauty of it is you can create that inside your organization.
Sure.
With those questions.
Yeah, I think the question, it got back to the simple thing. It's like, I don't know why companies aren't having that conversation. That's such a simple question, Mike. Who are we? Who do we serve? Leave it and let people come back. It reminds me of something years ago when I was at Aspen Dental as the manager of learning solutions. And I was working with the head of recruitment, and he was bringing in, 20 new recruiters because we had to open offices. And the only way you're opening offices is if you have a dentist. So these recruiters are brought. They knew nothing about dentistry, nothing about dentists, but they came from other industries. And the call to action was, we got to get them trained. I'm like, trained? Like, you need them to recruit dentists. What do you want to train them on? Well, they need to go through and understand all the products we serve and da-da-da. Yeah, is that right? And so I said, well, first question I asked, and it gets back to the one of the pain points of organizations. I said, do these new recruiters compete with the other recruiters? Like, is there any way they're competing? No, not at all. They're different regions. They're like, good to know. And you have some people on your team already, the 10 that you have already, they're pretty solid. Yeah, they're experts. They do things great here. I said, well, why don't we ask them just simple, going back to the word simple, the simple question: what are the top 10 things a dentist who might be interested in joining Aspen would ask? And say, all right. So we asked. We created this huge wiki of the answers, an FAQ, if you will.
Yeah.
Then I said, flip each of their responses back to another member on the team and see if that answer, how they would answer that question the doctor asked. And he panicked when he got the answers. He's like, I can't believe we're telling doctors that stuff. Like, we're wrong. People, my experts are not giving the right information. And I said, there's transparency right there, right? You created a transparency without having to be pejorative, and you opened up what the issues was. You could correct it now, and now you had a tool that you could give to every single one of your new recruiters to prepare for those conversations with dentists without any training. Simple questions, simple process, leverage your own expertise in-house, reduce the costs related to getting people. They hit the ground running within 2 weeks, which probably would have taken more like 2 months. So, I mean, again, simple question, ask the simple question, get the answer, and see what you can do with it.
If you're not achieving the results you want inside your organization, go back through these questions. Just listen to the questions that come up over the course of the last 6-7 minutes. Ask those questions, and you will reveal some very interesting things that might have you have that moment where like, oh, I can't believe we're saying this publicly.
Right.
The cool part about it is then you now know where you've got an understanding of current state. You can define desired state, and you can build a plan to get there. So, Mark, we talked a bit about some of the things that we can do internally to kind of understand where we are as an organization, how the gaps between where we are and where we want to be, areas where we can start to focus, honing in on the people aspect of what we're doing here. Well, there's a technology piece that is starting to create more and more disruption. And, although we've seen movies like Terminator, and we've seen Ex Machina, and we've seen all of these other ones where AI is coming over to take over the world, they've all been out there for a period of time. And now we're actually getting into to the point where people at the front line are able to use these tools. They can either go into ChatGPT through OpenAI, or they can leverage tools like the one we use for show notes for the podcast, which is Capshow, or Opus Clips for videos. There's all of these tools that are out there that can enable humans to do better human things. What are your thoughts around the technology and what we should be thinking about as leaders and operators and individuals who are performing inside the business? How should we be thinking about these technologies and what's to come?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting problem, and obviously an interesting opportunity, because they're not going away. I mean, as much as companies are like clamping down and want to have a chance to take a breath and look at what the risks are, with this, we know it's extremely disruptive, and it's not clearly going to be a Terminator's moment. It's going to be something that could be transformative. But two things come to mind. Is one, it's now more than ever to me is this becoming more social by design in an organization, to bring your people together to be able to talk openly about these technologies and how they're impacting their jobs, or how they want them to impact their jobs. I mean, that's the first part of it, because they're the ones, like you said, the frontline employees who have the opportunity, if you will, to engage with some of these things. The other thing is there's risk. The LLMs or Chat GPT type, I've been talking to a couple companies who are actually building their own internal Chat GPT, right? It makes sense. It's a walled garden, and you want a chat-based tool that can scour your internal resources securely and put together different content for different purposes. That's in the very simple terms, right? The risk there is that more and more people will use internally those tools to do that work and stop talking to each other. Because ultimately, what that LLM is doing is pulling on human created products and then putting them together in different ways. But if people stop talking and stop creating together, the source of information becomes kind of moot, right? After a while, its power, its impact is going to be drained, and you've leaned into those tools so much so, and away from the collaborative environment you need to populate the content in your company, the new ideas that can scour. That's a huge risk. And the only way you're going to keep up with producing is by, again, creating that environment that is conducive for social engagement between disparate parts of your organization. You want your people in accounting talking to your people in sales. You want your HR people talking to your frontline workers. So you want that happening and solving to feed the machine, if you will, to make it even more important.
Yeah. Just to reinforce the point that Mark just made, these are enabling technologies, enabling humans. They enable humans. If you take the human out of the equation, you're not really leveraging the strength and the capability and the future of the technology. I remember back when Mark had mentioned we were at SmartForce together. E-learning was going to eliminate the need for people to come together in the classroom.
Yep, that was the value proposition, Mike. Yeah.
It was going to eliminate it. And then what you ended up getting is you got feedback about, the better value proposition was actually you could level everybody up to a certain level before they come into the room. So now when they come into the room, more magic can happen. And
well put.
So when you start using these tools effectively, it's amazing what can happen. You have to interact with them. So get out there and test, and get out there and play with some of these tools. Mark, where can people find out where you're speaking, what you're working on? Where would you like people to connect with you?
You can always see what I'm up to on my website, markbritz.com. I post frequently on LinkedIn, always available there. Of course, I am the director of event programming at the Guild. So, Mike, I know I'm going to see you pretty soon at our upcoming events. So you can always catch me and talk about how to speak and be socially engaging at, let's say, our events and how you do that. But those would probably be the best platforms to find me on and see what I'm up to. And of course, I can't help but plug the book, Social by Design. It's a read I'm really proud of. It's really short. You can consume it in about 45 minutes. And the idea is, like Mike said, is to have those simple conversations in your organization about what you can do different in the design of your organization to encourage social connection.
Yeah, and there's a section we didn't get into that I think is really interesting for people to read through. It's the indicators that show that your organization is starting to move toward a negative trend. You're starting to see lower resilience inside the organization. You're starting to see more focus on policies rather than guidelines. You're starting to see some changes. So make sure you check out the book, and we'll include links in the show notes. I am very appreciative to the Guild for giving me an opportunity to do something that I've been working on over the course of the last year and change, which is getting out and speaking more. And a lot of what we just talked about here today applies to that. The engagement is so much higher when you put it back into the hands of the people who are in the room working through the challenge, rather than you trying to be the expert or the sage from the stage communicating things out. And you don't realize that until you actually see that in place. And it's through those reps that I've been able to get better on my side. So Mark, thank you for that opportunity.
Absolutely.
If you know of somebody who would enjoy this podcast, find the information interesting, find something that they can apply, especially those questions that we just talked about, share that with them and let Mark and I know via LinkedIn. Those shares help get the word out, and we like to see them. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about your process?